My grandfather never said he loved me. Not once, not at Christmas, not when I graduated, not even when my dad, his only son, died and it was just the two of us standing at the graveside in the January cold, breath fogging in the air between us. He just put his hand on my shoulder for exactly 3 seconds, then walked back to his truck. That was Grandpapa Theodore Marsh, 78 years old, 400 acres of river-bottom farmland in rural Kentucky, and a personality like a fence post, upright, useful, and completely impossible to read. So when the family lawyer called me on a Tuesday morning in March and said my grandfather had left me the farmhouse, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because I didn't know what else to do. "Just you," the lawyer said. His name was Mr. Callahan. He had the careful voice of a man delivering news he expected to cause a scene. The rest of the estate, the equipment, the livestock contracts, the savings accounts, he divided between your aunts and your uncle. But the house and the 2 acres it sits on go to you, Mr. Marsh. That was his specific and unambiguous instruction. I sat down on the edge of my bed in my apartment in Cincinnati. It was raining outside. I stared at the water running down the window glass and tried to remember the last time I'd been to that farmhouse. 7 years ago, maybe. The summer before my dad passed. My grandfather had made us waffles and then gone back out to the field without finishing his own breakfast. "Does it say why?" I asked. "No," Mr. Callahan said. "It doesn't." My Aunt Caroline called me before I'd even hung up with the lawyer. Then my Aunt Diane. Then my Uncle Ray, who didn't call but sent a text that said only, "We need to talk about what's fair." I turned my phone face down and booked a day off work. I drove down that Friday. 4 hours south, off the interstate, past the grain elevators and the dollar stores, and the churches with the changeable letter signs out front. The farmhouse sat at the end of a half-mile gravel drive, back from the county road, surrounded by the old oak grove my great-great-grandfather had planted in 1931. The house itself was 2 stories, white clapboard gone gray from weather, the front porch sagging on one side like a tired shoulder. It was cold inside. The utilities had been kept on. The lawyer had arranged that. But no one had been in the house since my grandfather died 6 weeks earlier, and it had the particular chill of a space that hadn't been breathed in for a while. I walked through slowly. The kitchen still had his coffee mug on the counter, a dish towel folded over the oven handle, a notepad by the phone with a grocery list in his handwriting, bread, WD-40, razor blades, and the date at the top was February 8th, 4 days before he had his stroke. I stood there for a long time holding that notepad. I didn't understand why he'd left me the house. I wasn't the oldest grandchild. I wasn't the one who'd stayed close, who'd helped him with harvests, or driven him to doctor's appointments. I was the one who'd moved away and built a life in the city and called on holidays and sometimes forgot to even do that. But he'd left me the house. I told myself I'd figure it out over the weekend. Clear some things out. Maybe get it ready to put on the market if that's what made sense. My uncle and aunts were already suggesting I sell. The property taxes alone were over $4,000 a year, they reminded me. What was I going to do with a farmhouse in rural Kentucky? That first night, I slept in my grandfather's bed because it was the only one with clean sheets. The mattress was old and firm and smelled like cedar and old wool. I lay in the dark and listened to the oak trees move outside and thought about how strange it is to inherit a space from someone. You get the shape of their life, the coffee mug, the grocery list, the sag in the porch, but you don't get the explanation. I fell asleep with the lamp on. I found it by accident. Saturday afternoon, I was going through the study, a small room off the main hallway that my grandfather used as a combination office and storage space. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on 2 walls, packed with the accumulated weight of a long life. Tax records going back to 1987, seed catalogs, veterinary manuals, a collection of Louis L'Amour paperbacks so old the spines had cracked white, a gun safe in the corner that I didn't have the combination to, a roll-top desk that stuck when I tried to open it. I was moving boxes from the bottom shelf, old bank statements, mostly, things I'd need to go through for the estate, when I noticed the floor. It was wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not wrong in a way you'd notice if you were just walking through. But I was crouched down close to the baseboard, and I could see that the floorboards near the back wall ran in a slightly different direction than the rest of the floor. Maybe 6 inches off. And there was a discoloration, faint, old, but there, like a rectangle had been cut and reset, and the stain had never quite matched up. I pulled the remaining boxes out of the way. The rectangle was about 3 feet by 4 feet. No visible handle, no hinge that I could see. I ran my fingers along the seams and found that they were cleaner than the rest of the floor. Newer grout or caulk, something that had been applied to seal them. I went to the kitchen and got a butter knife, worked it into the seam on one side. The section of floor lifted. Underneath was a metal panel, gray painted steel, with a recessed pull handle and a combination lock. I sat back on my heels and stared at it for a long moment. "Grandpa," I said out loud, "what did you do?" "The combination took me 2 hours. I tried his birthday first. Then my grandmother's birthday. She'd passed when I was 4, but I had the date from family records. Then my dad's birthday. Then the year the farm was homesteaded, which I found on a plaque in the hallway, 1894. Then the year my grandfather was born, and the year he married my grandmother, and the year my dad was born. It was my dad's birthday that opened it." The lock clicked. The panel swung up on a pneumatic hinge, silently, the way expensive things move. Below it was a steel ladder bolted to the wall of a concrete shaft about 4 feet across. A pull-cord light. I yanked it. The room below was maybe 12 by 14 feet. Concrete walls, concrete floor, a dehumidifier in one corner that was still running. I could hear it when I climbed down. Metal shelving units along 2 walls, a workbench, and on the shelving units, files, dozens of them. Hanging folders in labeled bankers' boxes, arranged by year, going back to 1978. Alongside them, several fireproof document cases, the kind with foam-sealed lids. A single manila envelope taped to the top of the nearest banker's box, with my name written on it in my grandfather's handwriting. My hands were shaking when I opened it. The letter inside was 3 pages, written longhand on yellow legal paper. My grandfather's handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of a man who'd learned to write when paper was something you didn't waste. "If you're reading this," it began, "then I was right about you. I wasn't always right about people, but I was right about you." I sat down on the bottom rung of the ladder and read. My grandfather had spent 40 years as a contract grain inspector for the federal government. It was the job he'd had before the farm, during the years he and my grandmother were building the place up. He'd retired in 1998, but the job had taken him to grain elevators and processing facilities all across the tri-state region, Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, and in that time he had seen things. The letter took me 20 minutes to read, and by the end of it, I understood that the files in those bankers' boxes represented something I did not have a word for yet. Not quite evidence, not exactly a confession. More like the meticulous, decades-long record of a man who had watched something wrong happen slowly, the way you watch a tree grow, imperceptibly, then suddenly, all at once. Beginning in the early 1980s, my grandfather had documented a pattern of fraudulent grain weight certifications at a cluster of private elevators in 3 counties. The elevators were all connected to a single agricultural holding company, and the scheme was simple in the way that the most durable frauds always are. Farmers brought in their grain to be weighed and graded, and the certifications they received understated the actual weight by 2 to 5%, not enough to notice on any single transaction. Compounded over hundreds of farms in 30 years, it amounted to tens of millions of dollars, transferred quietly from the pockets of small farmers into the accounts of the holding company. My grandfather had tried to report it, twice. Once in 1986, once in 1992. The first time, his supervisor had told him he was misreading the variance data. The second time, he'd gone above his supervisor to the regional office and had been informed 6 months later that the matter had been reviewed and no irregularities were found. He'd been reassigned to a different district shortly after, so he'd started keeping his own records. Every document he was legally entitled to copy, he copied. Every personal observation he was permitted to make, He wrote down and dated and filed. He had built, over the course of 4 decades, a parallel archive, meticulous, sourced, organized, of everything the official record had declined to see. The holding company, I learned from his files, was still operating. It had grown. It was now one of the largest agricultural processing businesses in the region, with contracts tied to 4 county governments and 2 state-level commodity boards. And at the bottom of the 3rd page of his letter, my grandfather had written, "I am giving this to you because you are the only one in this family who went into law. I know you left it. I know you think that part of your life is finished. But I need someone who knows how to read what's in these boxes. And I need someone who will actually use it. I am sorry I never told you any of this while I was alive. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding like a crazy old man. Maybe I am a crazy old man, but the math is in those files, and the math does not lie. I had left law school in my 2nd year. My grandfather had never once mentioned it. I hadn't known he was paying attention. I sat in that concrete room for a long time. The dehumidifier hummed. Above me, through the open hatch, I could see the afternoon light going amber through the study window. I thought about my uncle's text, "We need to talk about what's fair." I thought about $4,000 a year in property taxes and a farmhouse nobody wanted. I thought about my grandfather standing at my father's graveside with his hand on my shoulder for exactly 3 seconds. Then I climbed back up the ladder and called my former law school roommate, who had gone on to become a federal agricultural compliance attorney in Louisville. His name was Craig. He answered on the 2nd ring. "I need you to come to Kentucky," I said, "and I need you to bring your case files on agricultural fraud statutes, because I think I have something you're going to want to see." There was a pause. "How big?" Craig said. I looked down through the open hatch at the rows of bankers' boxes below. 30 years big, I said. Tri-state. Still active. Another pause. Then, "I'll be there tomorrow morning." Craig arrived at 7:30 Sunday morning with a travel mug of coffee and the focused expression of a man who had been thinking about something for the entire 4-hour drive. I met him at the door and took him straight to the study and showed him the hatch. He climbed down into the room and stood there for a moment, turning slowly, looking at the shelving units the way you look at something you're not sure is real. "Your grandfather built this room?" he said. "I think so, yeah, by himself. That's my guess." He pulled a banker's box from the shelf, opened it, looked at the hanging folders inside, pulled one out, read for a minute, put it back, pulled another. "This is contemporaneous," he said quietly, almost to himself. "These are contemporaneous observations with dates and signatures. This is," he stopped. "Do you know how rare this is? Most of the time with something like this, you get one disgruntled employee with a shoebox of photocopies. This is systematic. This is organized." He was a federal inspector, I said. He knew how records worked. Craig looked up at me. "What do you want to do with this?" I'd been thinking about that since the afternoon before. I'd turned it over from every angle I could think of. The practical angles. What it would cost me in time and disruption. Whether I even had standing to do anything. Whether the statute of limitations had run on any of it. The personal angles. What my grandfather had wanted. Why he'd waited. Why he'd left it to me. And the simple angle. The one I kept coming back to. "There are farmers in 3 states who got cheated for 30 years, I said. "Some of them are probably still getting cheated. I want to do something about that." Craig looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Then let me tell you what we're going to need." What we needed, it turned out, was about 6 weeks and a USDA Office of Inspector General field agent named Reeves, whom Craig had worked with before, and who had the flat, patient energy of someone who had spent her career waiting for exactly this kind of phone call. I didn't go back to Cincinnati. I worked remotely from the farmhouse, sleeping in my grandfather's bed and drinking his coffee and going through the files with Craig in the evenings. We built a timeline. We cross-referenced his observations against publicly available commodity price records, against the USDA's own inspection reports, against satellite imagery of the elevator facilities going back to the early 2000s. What my grandfather had documented with paper and pencil, we were able to corroborate with data that hadn't existed when he was gathering it. The holding company had been careful, but careful is not the same as invisible. Not over 30 years. Not when someone has been watching. My Aunt Caroline called again in week 2. She'd heard I was staying at the house. She asked if I'd thought about the offer from the developer. Apparently, a regional housing company had already been in contact with my uncle about the property. "I'm not selling," I said. A silence. Then, "Honey, you're being sentimental. What are you going to do with a farmhouse in?" "I'm working on something," I said. "I'll explain it when I can." She didn't call back after that. My Uncle Ray drove out in week 3. I saw his truck come up the gravel drive and went out to meet him on the porch. He was a big man, my uncle, the kind who took up space in a room and knew it. He'd been farming his own land for 30 years, and he had the particular resentment of someone who had stayed and watched someone else leave and prosper. "I heard you're not selling," he said. "That's right. You know what the taxes on this place run." "I do." He looked at the house, then back at me. "Dad never talked about you, you know." "Not really. I always figured that meant he didn't care one way or the other. I thought about the letter. I was right about you. I think he just didn't know how to say the things he meant." My uncle made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He stood there for another moment, looking at the oak trees. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. Agent Reeves made her first visit to the farmhouse in week 4. She was thorough and quiet, and she spent 3 hours in the basement room going through files before she came back up and sat at my grandfather's kitchen table and wrote notes on a yellow legal pad, the same kind he'd used for his letter to me. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "This is going to take time. The statute of limitations issue is complicated. There are going to be things in here we can use and things we can't. But the core of what your grandfather documented, the systematic variance fraud, there are current year records in those boxes, because he kept going right up until last year, and current year records are not a limitations problem." "How current?" I asked. "Most recent folder in the last box is dated October," she said. 5 months ago. I hadn't gotten that far in the files. I sat with that for a moment. He had been doing this until 5 months before he died. Into his late 70s, alone in this house, still pulling the thread. Still waiting for someone to hand it to. "The farmers who were defrauded," I said. "Can they get any of it back?" "Some of them. Probably not all. It's going to depend on records, on whether the businesses are still operating, on a dozen things I can't predict right now." She looked at me across the table. "But the company is still doing it, that we can stop." I nodded. "Your grandfather was a careful man," she said. It sounded like a compliment, which I think it was. "He was," I said. "The investigation became official in month 2. I can't talk about most of what happened after that. Not yet, not while proceedings are still ongoing. What I can tell you is that the USDA OIG opened a formal inquiry, that Craig's firm agreed to represent a class of affected farmers on a contingency basis, and that the holding company's legal team sent me a letter in month 3 through my own attorney suggesting that I had interfered with lawful business operations by providing records to federal investigators. My attorney sent a letter back. I paid the property taxes on the farmhouse from my savings. It hurt, but not as much as I expected. In month 4, I drove out to see a man named Mr. Pruitt, who farmed about 300 acres 20 miles south of my grandfather's place. He was in his late 60s, and he'd been selling grain to one of the holding company's elevators for most of his working life. Agent Reeves had cleared me to speak with him. He met me on his porch. He was a small, wiry man with hands that looked like they were made of something harder than skin. I explained who I was and what my grandfather had documented, and in general terms, what the investigation had found. He was quiet for a long time when I finished. "Theodore Marsh," he finally said, "I knew your grandfather, not well. We were in the same county inspector district back in the 80s, before he got reassigned." He looked out at his fields. The corn was just coming up, pale green rows against dark soil. "I always thought something was off with those weights. Couldn't ever prove it." "He spent 40 years proving it," I said. Mr. Pruitt was quiet again. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" "I'm writing this from the farmhouse. It's late May now. The oak trees have leafed out, and the fields around the property are green and loud with spring. I fixed the sagging side of the front porch last weekend with lumber from the hardware store in town and a YouTube tutorial, which my grandfather would have had opinions about, though he never would have said them out loud. I haven't moved back permanently. I'm still figuring out what that looks like. But I'm here more than I'm in Cincinnati, and most mornings I make coffee in the kitchen and stand at the window and drink it the same way he must have stood here and drunk his. The grocery list is still on the notepad by the phone. I haven't been able to throw it away. I keep thinking about the combination on that hatch. My dad's birthday. Of all the numbers he could have chosen, his own birthday, the year of the farm, my grandmother's date, he chose my dad's, his son who died at 51, the person he'd lost and never, as far as I could tell, talked about. I think the lock was the only way he knew how to say certain things. I think the whole room was. The files were his life's work, yes, but they were also something else. They were the thing he left behind to tell me that he'd been paying attention. To the world, to the wrong being done in it, to me and who I was and what I might be able to do. He couldn't say any of that at a graveside. He couldn't say it over waffles or on a holiday phone call, but he could build a room underground and spend 40 years filling it and trust that I would find it and know what it meant. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the investigation, not the legal proceedings, not even the farmers who might get some portion of what they were owed returned to them after 30 years. Just the fact that he built the room at all. Just the fact that he wrote my name on the envelope. You never really know someone while they're alive. Not all the way. The parts of them that don't have language, the parts they carry in silence for 40 years, and can only leave behind in a sealed room under the floorboards of an old farmhouse. Those parts you only find after. I'm grateful I came down to find them. I don't know if I would have stayed if I'd known what I was walking into. I don't know if I would have made the same choices. But I keep thinking about what he wrote at the end of that letter, the last line, which I've read probably 100 times now. The math does not lie. Neither should you. He was right. About the math. About me. About what I was supposed to do. I think maybe that's what he was trying to say all along.